All right, so we're going to prepare a production report here for the creatively named Omar Company. Remember, production report, this is the end deliverable for a process costing system that a company would have in place. When would a company want to have a process costing system in place? Generally, if they're producing large volume of homogeneous products, it makes much more sense to track production on a process basis. So if there's three major steps for production and we're producing large volumes, then it's probably better to track on a per step, or in this case per process base, as opposed to job order costing system where each product is unique and you would track on a per job basis. So let's see how that applies here to this example. So Omar Company produces sneakers. The assembly department, which is the first process department, assembles the sneakers before passing it on to the next process department. The following data are for September. So at the beginning of the month, work in process, there was nothing in process. During the month, they started 90,000 units. They transferred out 75,000 units, meaning ending work in process was 15,000 units. Costs incurred during the month: direct materials of 84,000, direct labor of 168,000, overhead applied was 336,000. Direct materials are added throughout the process. Excuse me. Ending inventory is 60% complete with respect to direct labor and overhead. Prepare a production report for the month of September using the attached template. So we have the template here, and I've already filled in the boxes for yellow. One thing I want to mention here is the heading. For this, you would have the company in the name, in this case, Omar. What did I call it? Omar Company. Again, very creative on my part. Omar Company. You'd have the department name. In this case, it'd be the assembly department. I'll just go ahead and fill in Omar Company. And in this case, it was for the month ended September 30. Again, what that shows is during the month of September, within the assembly department, how many units did this department produce or have passed through, essentially. As we said, there's two general sections to a production report. We have the unit information, which is everything up here, the first half, and then we have the cost information, which is down here, which we'll get to in a second. The unit information, what we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out how many units do we have to account for, essentially. And we compare that by comparing the units to account for, and then we reconcile it essentially with the units that we've actually accounted for. So starting on the left-hand side here, we're trying to figure out how many units do we have to account for. And how we check that is units beginning in work in process plus units started gets us that units to account for. So units that were in beginning work in process, again, if you go back to the question, beginning work in process, there was nothing. There were 0 units. So that's an easy one. We enter 0. Units that were started during the month were 90,000 units. So if we had nothing to begin with, we started 90,000 units. The amount of units that we are working on at various stages is 90,000 units. So that's how many units we have to account for in this production report. The second half of the top part here is now we're figuring out, okay, of this 90,000 units that we have to account for, where are they? What stage of production are they in? In this scenario, we have units completed plus units in ending work in process. That equals our units accounted for. And notice these numbers should match. Units to account for should equal units accounted for, because again, we are trying to account for all the units that we should account for. So of the 90,000, based off of the question stem, 75,000 units were transferred out. And when we say transferred out, it means completed with respect to the assembly department. It doesn't necessarily mean that the item is ready to be sold to the end consumer, but we are doing this production report for the assembly department. So once it is through the entire process of assembly, it is completed for our purposes or this department's purposes. So that's why we mark it as units completed. So we have 75,000 units transferred out or completed. We had 15,000 units in ending work in process based off of the information given. You add those up, lo and behold, we have accounted for all 90,000 units. If those two numbers did not match, I should say, then you haven't accounted for everything. You're missing something there. So that's the physical number. If I was to count, physically count, I would count 90,000 units pass through the assembly department. Now, that's not the entirety of the production report. We also have to figure out the equivalent units. Equivalent units, we said, is respect to how far along of the process are they, the production process. Meaning, from a production cost standpoint, what percent of material, labor, and overhead have they consumed, and therefore, how many units fully could we have completed if we had allocated all of the material, labor, and overhead to units until they were completed, as opposed to every unit that we started. So for units completed, since all 75,000 were started this month and were completed, those are 100% complete with respect to this equivalent units measure. So units completed under equivalent units is going to be the same as the actual physical units completed, 75,000. The difference now deals with ending work in process. Remember, this $9,000 or 9,000 unit figure, this is a theoretical number. It's not the actual amount. The actual units in ending work in process is 15,000. But if we had used the same amount of material, labor, and overhead, instead of producing 15,000 partially completed units, how many fully completed units could we have done with the same amount? Well, as it said in the question, they are material is added throughout the process. Ending inventory is 60% complete, and it should be for all costs. Meaning of this 15,000, I have 15,000 units that are each 60% complete. Theoretically, I could have fully completed with that same effort, that same cost, 15,000 times 60%, I could have fully completed 9,000 units with the same material, labor, and overhead costs. So that is the equivalent units in ending work in process. And remember, this equivalent units, this is a theoretical output. So based off of the effort, the cost I incurred during the month of September, I could have fully completed 84,000 units. And remember, why do we want to calculate this number? Is because it's going to be the denominator in our cost per unit calculation. I can't use 90,000 units because this is a mix of both fully completed and partially completed. I want to use this equivalent units measure because this represents the theoretical amount of fully completed units I could have completed during the month. So there's no mixing of different types of inventory. They're all theoretically fully completed. Therefore, I get a better, more accurate cost per unit amount. Now let's go to the second half of the production cost report, which is the costing information. Similar kind of setup, but now instead of units to account for and units accounted for, we're looking at costs to account for and then costs accounted for. So our costs to account for, we have to figure out how much costs we need to figure out or to reconcile essentially to see how much we took in during the month of September. So since we had no beginning units in work in process, we didn't have any beginning work in process costs. So that was 0. The costs that were added during the month, again, if you go back to the question, material of 84,000, labor of 168, overhead applied of 336. If you add all of that up, and you can see the elements are there, costs incurred, production costs incurred during the month, 588,000. So the total costs we have to account for is 588,000. So it's a question of where do those costs end up? I'll get to this calculation here in a sec. Actually, no, we can look at that now. We incurred 588,000 in production costs during the month. And remember, what did that actually produce? What did that go into? Theoretically, it produced 84,000 units of fully completed inventory, giving me an average cost per equivalent unit of $7 a piece. I need this number now to figure out where do these amounts end up on my financials. So now I know I have to account for 588,000. It's a question of where does this 588,000 go? Well, goods completed and transferred, they're going to be transferred out of the assembly department's work in process, and they're going to move to the next process department. So I'm going to transfer out $525,000 worth of production costs from the assembly department. How did I calculate that? I took my cost per equivalent unit, the $7 a piece, and I multiply that by the units completed and transferred out, the equivalent units completed and transferred out, which was 75,000. The amount of costs that remain in the department is my equivalent units ending work in process, which was 9,000 units, which we calculated before. How do I calculate that 63,000? It's simply the number of units in ending work in process, the equivalent units, which was 9,000, times that $7 per equivalent unit. So again, we're using the same cost rate there of $7 a piece.